Did you know there is a family in Idaho worth nearly $4 billion, and you have almost certainly eaten their product today without knowing their name? That's right. Every McDonald's French fry in America runs through them, on a deal sealed with nothing but a handshake in the 1960s that is still holding today. This is the Simplot family, and they quietly own a huge piece of this state. But to truly understand their wealth scale, you need to first understand the other 7 families they're standing above, because the Simplots are not the only Idaho family this rich. And trust me, the stories only get crazier and crazier as we move towards number 1. Let's dive in. Number 8. The Albertson family. Let's start with a man who had to borrow money to open a single grocery store, and who ended up giving $750 million back to the state that let him do it. Joe Albertson graduated from Caldwell High School in 1925, studied business for 2 years at the College of Idaho, and then spent his 20s working in grocery stores for other people. He was 32 years old before he opened one of his own, and even then he had to borrow the money to do it. That first store opened in Boise in 1939, built on 3 principles he never really deviated from: quality, good value, and excellent service. It sounds almost quaint now, but he'd noticed something the established chains hadn't, which is that American grocery shopping was about to change completely, and the winners would be the ones who made the store itself an experience rather than a chore. What grew out of that single Boise storefront became Albertsons, one of the largest grocery chains in the entire United States, with thousands of locations spread across the country. And for decades, the corporate headquarters stayed right there in Boise, which meant that a huge amount of Idaho's white-collar employment ran through a company started by a man who'd borrowed his seed money. But here's what actually earns the Albertsons a spot on this list, and it isn't the stores. Joe and his wife Catherine started the J.A. and Catherine Albertson Foundation, and that foundation has since given more than $750 million to Idaho communities. Not to national causes, not to prestige projects in other states, to Idaho. Schools, education initiatives, community programs, spread across a state with a population smaller than the city of Houston. Joe died in 1993. The money never left. Albertson's fortune came from selling groceries across the country. Number 7's came from convincing the entire country to visit one lake. Number 7. The Hagedorn family. At 9 years old, Dwayne Hagedorn was cutting neighbors' lawns for pocket change. At 11, he had a paper route. His parents wanted him at the University of Idaho, so he went, and he lasted about 6 months before quitting to go work at the Coeur d'Alene Press, where his father was the publisher. He started by selling newspaper subscriptions door-to-door across rural Kootenai County, then classified ads. Then he became an advertising salesman. And then his father died suddenly of cancer at 49, which Hagedorn described as losing his closest friend. He took over as publisher, and by 1976, the Hagedorn newspaper company owned 17 papers. But newspapers were never the real story. Here's what he actually understood, and it's the thing everyone else in northern Idaho had missed. Coeur d'Alene at the time was a mining, timber, and agriculture town. Nobody was thinking about tourism. Hagedorn looked at a lake that National Geographic would later call one of the most beautiful in the world, and realized the town was sitting on an asset it wasn't selling. So in 1986, he opened the Coeur d'Alene Resort, 18 stories and 338 rooms right on the lakeshore. And then, in the early 90s, he did the thing that put the place on the map worldwide. He built a golf course with the world's only floating green. Think about that for a second. The 14th hole is on an island that moves. It floats on the lake, and they reposition it, which means the yardage changes depending on the day. It is a genuinely absurd piece of engineering that exists purely to make people talk, and it worked. Golf Magazine, Golf Digest, and Golf World have all ranked that course among the finest groomed in North America. The Hagedorn Corporation now spans hospitality, golf, restaurants, real estate, media, publishing, advertising, marine, and aviation. It bought Hawaii's largest printing company and 13 Hawaiian tourist publications. One of Hagedorn's own Coeur d'Alene homes went on the market at $27.5 million, and another sat on 15 gated acres. He died in 2021 at 88, and his line about it all was that he loved what he did so much he felt he'd never worked a day in his life. His only real regret was never finishing college. Hagedorn turned a northern Idaho lake into a destination. Number 6 bought the mountain at the other end of the state, and he ran an oil company to pay for it. Number 6. The Holding family. Sun Valley is the reason a lot of people have heard of Idaho at all. It was America's first destination ski resort, built by the Union Pacific Railroad in the 1930s, specifically to give people a reason to ride trains west, and it invented the chairlift to do it. Hemingway wrote there. Gary Cooper skied there, and by the 1970s it was fading. Speaking of a fading icon waiting for someone with fresh eyes, there's a program someone on our team has been curious about called the Billionaire Brain Wave. It's a simple 7-minute audio built around theta brainwave research, the deep focus brain state linked to where big creative ideas come from. You put on headphones once a day, usually with your morning coffee, and that's the whole routine. It's a one-time $39. It comes with bonus guides on money habits and investing basics, and there's a 90-day money-back guarantee. So testing it costs you nothing if it's not for you. If you're watching on your TV, pause and scan the QR code on screen with your phone camera, or tap the first link in the description. Now, back to the man who stepped in to save Sun Valley. Robert Earl Holding bought it in 1977. Now, Holding is one of the more unusual figures on this list because his money didn't come from Idaho at all. He came up through the hotel business, building the Little America chain out of Salt Lake City, and then he acquired Sinclair Oil Corporation, the company with the green dinosaur on the sign that you have probably filled up at without ever wondering who owned it. So this was a Utah oil and hotel man buying a struggling Idaho ski mountain. And what he did with it is why he belongs here. He poured an enormous amount of money into the place over decades, rebuilding lifts, expanding the resort, and restoring it to the standard it had when the railroad built it. Forbes listed him at $2.6 billion. And for a stretch, he was the only person from Idaho on the Forbes 400 list at all. But here's the part that matters for this video, and it explains the entire next entry. By restoring Sun Valley, the Holding family turned a small mountain town in central Idaho into one of the most desirable addresses in the American West. Not for tourists, for billionaires. Holding died in 2013 at 86, and the family has continued running Sinclair, Little America, and Sun Valley since. Holding built the magnet. Number 5 is what got pulled in by it, and it has quietly changed who Idaho's richest people actually are. Number 5. The Sun Valley transplants. Here's a question that gets at something strange about wealth in this state. Every July, a small Idaho town of a few thousand people hosts a private gathering that has been described as summer camp for billionaires. It's the Allen and Company Conference in Sun Valley, and it is genuinely one of the most consequential private meetings on Earth. One year, it drew 18 billionaires with a combined net worth of around $140 billion, which at the time exceeded the entire annual economic output of more than 170 countries, including Singapore, Morocco, and New Zealand. Media empires have been merged in that valley. Deals worth tens of billions have started over a hike. And a lot of the people who came for the conference eventually bought houses. Look at who lives in Ketchum, the town right next to Sun Valley today. David McMillan is there, worth around $1.2 billion, and his fortune comes from Cargill, the largest privately held company in the United States, headquartered 1,500 miles away in Minnesota. He is one of a whole cluster of Cargill heirs who scattered into the Mountain West. So here's the uncomfortable truth this entry gets at. A significant portion of the money now sitting in Idaho was not made in Idaho. It was made in Minnesota or Chicago or New York, and then it moved here for the mountains, the privacy, and a tax situation considerably friendlier than California's. The Simplots built their fortune out of Idaho dirt. The Hagedorns built theirs out of an Idaho lake. But an increasing share of the state's wealth simply flew in, bought a compound, and stayed. And the woman who now tops the entire list of richest Idaho residents is exactly that story. That's the pattern. Now here's the person at the top of it. Number 4. Margaret Baker. If you pull up the list of the richest people living in the state of Idaho right now, the name at the top is Margaret Baker, with a net worth of roughly $3.8 billion. She lives in Ketchum, and her fortune has essentially nothing to do with Idaho. Baker is a member of the Mills family, the family behind Medline Industries, which is one of the largest medical supply companies in the world. And the scale of it is genuinely difficult to picture, because Medline makes the stuff that every hospital in America runs on without anyone ever noticing. Gloves, gowns, surgical kits, examination supplies. Unglamorous, invisible, and utterly essential. The family history here is a proper dynasty. Her brother Charlie Mills ran Medline as chief executive for 26 years until 2023 and is still chairman. Her cousin Andy Mills was president over the same period and still sits on the board. Andy's brother-in-law was the chief operating officer for a quarter of a century. For decades, this was a company run almost entirely by relatives. Then came the money events. In 2021, the family sold 79% of Medline to a group of private equity firms in a leveraged buyout that valued the company at more than $30 billion. And in December of 2025, Medline went public on the NASDAQ, finishing its first day of trading with a market capitalization north of $55 billion. The extended Mills family still holds roughly 17%, and that stake alone has produced 5 separate billionaires. Margaret Baker is one of them, and she chose to live in a mountain town in Idaho. So the single richest resident of this state made her money in medical supplies out of Illinois. Which raises an obvious question, and it's the one this whole video is really about. Who actually built the wealth that came out of Idaho itself? Starting with 4 engineers in a basement. Number 3. The Parkinson Brothers. On the 5th of October 1978, 4 men rented the basement of a dentist's office at the corner of Cole Road and Northview Street in Boise and started designing memory chips. They were Ward Parkinson, his twin brother Joe, Dennis Wilson, and Doug Pittman, and they had all come out of a semiconductor company called Mostek. They called the new outfit Micron Technology, and their business plan was almost comically narrow because they had exactly one customer, Mostek itself. Ward Parkinson told a trade publication at the time, in plain terms, that they were not looking for other customers. Then 2 things went wrong at once. Mostek got beaten to a critical chip design by Fujitsu, and shortly afterward, Mostek collapsed. Micron's entire customer base, which was one company, evaporated. And it gets worse because the historian Chris Miller, who wrote the definitive book on the semiconductor industry, describes 1978 as the worst possible moment in history to start a memory chip company. Japanese manufacturers were flooding the market with high-quality chips at prices American firms simply could not match. Intel would eventually quit the memory business. Motorola quit. Dozens of American companies quit. 4 guys in a dentist's basement in Boise did not quit. They convinced local Idaho businessmen to put in $300,000 of seed money, and those businessmen made an introduction that changed the state. We'll get to who that was shortly, but the money arrived. Micron broke ground on its first Boise fabrication plant in July of 1980 and went public in June of 1984 at $13 a share. Today, Micron has around 53,000 employees, did over $37 billion in revenue in 2025, and holds more than 14,000 U.S. patents. Its headquarters is still on Federal Way in Boise, in the building that seed money paid for. Its chips are in phones and cars, and the data centers running artificial intelligence. And on the 26th of May, 2026, Micron's market capitalization crossed $1 trillion. From a dentist's basement to $1 trillion without ever leaving Boise. The Parkinsons built it. Number 2 built something entirely different, and he did it after living in a laundromat. Number 2. The Vandersloot family. Frank Vandersloot grew up on a ranch in Cocolala in northern Idaho, chopping wood, feeding chickens, and milking cows. When he was 12, his father had to take a job on the railroad to keep the family afloat, which meant a 12-year-old was effectively running the farm. He put himself through school partly by living in a laundromat. I want to sit on that for a second because it's the kind of detail that sounds like a tall tale until you see it in his official Forbes biography. He lived in a laundromat. He got an associate's degree from Ricks College, then a marketing degree from Brigham Young. He went into sales at Automatic Data Processing, became a regional vice president at Cox Communications, and then, in 1985, he walked away from a corporate career to start a company in Idaho Falls. That company is Melaleuca, and it now makes over 450 products, mostly wellness supplements and environmentally friendly household cleaners, sold directly to consumers rather than through stores. It does more than $2 billion in annual sales across 20 countries, and Forbes has repeatedly named it one of the best employers in America. His net worth has been put at around $3.2 billion, and Forbes gave him a self-made score of 10, which is the maximum. But the part that makes him one of the true owners of this state is the land. Vandersloot owns roughly 117,500 acres across Idaho, Montana, and Utah, which at one point made him the 92nd largest landowner in the United States. On it, he runs Riverbend Ranch and one of the largest elite registered Angus herds in the country. He also owns a radio network, and he has 14 children. When Forbes named him Idaho's richest person, his response was not what you'd expect. He said he wouldn't call it an honor at all, that he worries about lists like that, and that it says very little about a society when it puts value on things like that. He said he'd rather be remembered as somebody honest, who dealt fairly with people. Vandersloot built one fortune. Number 1 built a fortune and then funded somebody else's. Number 1. The Simplot family. In 1929, a 20-year-old who had walked out of school at 14 after a fight with his father won an electric potato sorter in a coin toss. That is not a metaphor. John Richard Simplot, known his whole life as Jack, flipped a coin, won a machine that sorted potatoes, and started a business with it. 97 years later, that business does around $9.8 billion a year in sales across 60 countries and is still entirely owned by his family, because Jack Simplot never once took on a partner. The path from there to here is one of the great American business stories. During the Second World War, he worked out how to dehydrate potatoes and onions at scale to feed the military. And when wartime shortages made fertilizer impossible to buy, he simply built his own plant in Pocatello and made it himself. Then, in the late 1940s, his company created the first commercially viable frozen French fry in the world and patented the process in 1953. Now here's why that mattered so much. Ray Kroc was building McDonald's into a national chain, and McDonald's wasn't really selling hamburgers, it was selling sameness. A fry in Boise had to taste identical to a fry in Miami. And at that point, restaurant workers were peeling, cutting, and blanching potatoes by hand in every single location. Simplot's frozen fry solved that completely. The two men sealed the deal in the 1960s with a handshake. No contract. And that relationship is still running today, nearly 60 years later, which is why the title of this video says McDonald's depends on them. By 2005, Simplot was supplying more than half of all McDonald's fries, and the company today also supplies Burger King, Wendy's, Chick-fil-A, Whataburger, Jack in the Box, and Trader Joe's. Americans eat something like 1.6 billion pounds of McDonald's fries a year. He became Idaho's first billionaire in 1967, and he drove around Boise in a Lincoln Town car with a license plate that read MR Spud. But the single greatest decision of his life had nothing to do with potatoes. In 1980, aged 70, Jack Simplot was driven out to a nondescript dentist's office near Fairview and Cole. His son-in-law, who later became governor of Idaho, was behind the wheel and admitted afterwards that he spent the whole drive wondering what on earth the old man was doing now. In that basement were the Parkinson brothers, whose only customer had just gone bankrupt, in what was the worst year in history to start a memory chip company. Simplot looked at it and said, "Boys, it's a gamble, and we're going to take it." Then, he wrote a check for $1 million and took 40% of the company. He later put it in his own words. He said he put the first $1 million into Micron, owned 40% of it, and that it had been a howling success, and that they would build the memory for the world. He died in 2008 at 99, worth $3.7 billion. His son Scott is now chairman, with 5 family members sitting on the board. And in May of 2026, the little chip company he backed in a dentist's basement became worth $1 trillion. A man who quit school at 14 and won his first machine on a coin toss fed the world's biggest restaurant chain, and then funded the semiconductor company that now sits at the center of the artificial intelligence economy. From the same office, in the same town. And that's who really owns Idaho. What gets me about this state is the gap between how it's perceived and what's actually here. Potatoes account for around $2.5 billion of Idaho's economy, roughly 15% of everything the state produces, so the potato thing is real. But so is a trillion-dollar chip company, a grocery empire, a ski resort that changed a valley, and a billionaire summit every July that most Americans have never heard of. So which one got you? The 4 engineers in a dentist's basement who ended up worth $1 trillion, the man who lived in a laundromat and now owns 117,000 acres, or the handshake over French fries that's still holding 60 years later? Drop it in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe to Global Status because we break down empires like this every single week.